This is the story of Abraham. Chapter 1: The Call of Abraham. Abraham, originally named Abram, was born in the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia. He lived in a world full of idols and false gods, but at the age of 75, everything changed. God called Abram to leave behind everything he knew, his country, his family, and his home, to journey to a land God would show him. God's command was clear, but it required great faith and trust in a promise that Abram could not yet see. He was told that through him, a great nation would arise, and his name would be blessed. Abram believed God's promise, and without hesitation, he packed up his family and possessions, setting off into the unknown. Abram was accompanied by his wife Sarai, later Sarah, his nephew Lot, and his household. They traveled to Canaan, where God appeared to Abram and assured him that this land would one day belong to his descendants. This was the beginning of a journey that would transform Abram into the father of nations. He did not know what awaited him, but he trusted in God's word, understanding that this call was not just to a new land, but to a new life of faith and obedience. Though he left behind all he knew, he stepped forward in faith, ready to follow God's plan. Chapter 2: God's Covenant with Abraham. After arriving in Canaan, God appeared to Abram and reaffirmed his promises. God told Abram that he would give the land of Canaan to his descendants, though at that time, Abram had no children. God also revealed that his descendants would eventually become a great nation. However, God shared a difficult prophecy that Abram's offspring would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years before returning to possess the land of Canaan. Despite these troubling details, God promised Abram that his descendants would inherit the land. In faith, Abram believed God's word. God counted Abram's trust as righteousness. To mark this covenant, God instructed Abram to prepare a sacrifice. As the sun set, God revealed a vision to Abram, showing him the future of his descendants. God also promised that he would never leave Abram, and that through him, all nations on earth would be blessed. God changed Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of many nations, and assured him that he would be faithful to his promises. Though the path was uncertain and full of challenges, God's covenant with Abraham remained unshaken. Abraham's faith in God's promises set the stage for the unfolding of God's plan for humanity. Chapter 3: The Birth of Ishmael. As the years passed, Abraham and Sarai grew older, and still they had no children. Sarai, unable to have children, grew impatient with God's promise. She suggested to Abraham that he have a child with her servant Hagar to fulfill God's promise through another way. Abraham agreed, and Hagar became pregnant, giving birth to a son named Ishmael. Although Abraham loved Ishmael, he knew this was not the child through whom God's promises would be fulfilled. God appeared to Abraham and confirmed that his covenant would not be passed through Ishmael, but through a son born of Sarah. Despite the human effort to help God's promise along, God made it clear that Sarah, though advanced in age, would bear Abraham a son. This child would be the heir of God's covenant, the one through whom Abraham's descendants would become a great nation. Abraham, grateful for Ishmael, prayed for God to bless him as well. But God reassured Abraham that while Ishmael would be blessed and become the father of a great nation, Isaac, the son Sarah would bear, was the child of promise. This reaffirmed God's plan. His promises would be fulfilled through Sarah's miraculous pregnancy, not through human effort. Chapter 4: The Promise Fulfilled, Isaac's Birth. At the age of 100, Abraham and Sarah finally received the incredible news that Sarah would bear a son. Both were advanced in age, and Sarah had long been barren, but God's promise was about to be fulfilled. Sarah laughed in disbelief at first, but God reassured them that the child would be born as a result of his miraculous power. Abraham was told to name the boy Isaac, meaning laughter, to remind them of the joy and surprise of God's promise coming true. Isaac's birth was a fulfillment of God's covenant, a sign that nothing is impossible for God. It was a miracle that proved God's faithfulness and power to keep his promises, even against all human expectations. When Isaac was born, Abraham and Sarah were overjoyed. This child would carry the covenant forward, and through him, the blessings God promised to Abraham would continue. God's faithfulness in Isaac's birth marked a turning point in Abraham's journey. Isaac became the heir of God's promises, the beginning of a new generation, and the one through whom Abraham's descendants would grow into a great nation. The miraculous birth of Isaac confirmed that God was in control, and his plans would unfold exactly as he had promised. Chapter 5. The Test of Abraham's Faith. When Isaac grew older, God tested Abraham in one of the most challenging ways imaginable. God commanded Abraham to take Isaac, the son he loved, to the mountain of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. This was an incredibly difficult command, as Isaac was the promised child, the one through whom God's covenant would continue. Yet Abraham, without hesitation, obeyed God. He took Isaac, 2 servants, and supplies for the sacrifice, and they journeyed to the mountain. When they reached the mountain, Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, but just as he raised the knife to strike his son, God intervened. An angel called out to Abraham, stopping him, and told him not to harm Isaac. Abraham had passed the test. His faith and trust in God were unshakable. To provide a substitute for Isaac, a ram was caught in a thicket, and Abraham sacrificed it in Isaac's place. God praised Abraham for his obedience and faith, and he renewed his covenant with him, promising to bless his descendants and make them as numerous as the stars. This event, known as the binding of Isaac, showed that Abraham trusted God above all else, and God's promises were assured, not just to Abraham, but to all generations after him. Chapter 6. Abraham's Legacy and Death. After the test of faith with Isaac, Abraham continued to walk faithfully with God. He made sure that his son Isaac would carry on the covenant by arranging for Isaac to marry Rebekah, a woman from his own family. This union ensured the continuation of God's promises. Abraham also had other children with his second wife, Keturah, but Isaac remained the chosen heir to God's covenant. When Abraham was 175 years old, he passed away and was buried by Isaac and Ishmael in the cave of Machpelah, a burial site he had purchased in Canaan. Abraham's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on through Isaac, his covenant promises, and the nations that would arise from his descendants. Before his death, Abraham had received numerous blessings, and his faithfulness to God was remembered. Isaac inherited the promises God made to Abraham, and through Isaac's children, the nation of Israel would eventually emerge. Abraham's life was a testimony of God's faithfulness, his ability to fulfill promises, and the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when it seems impossible. Chapter 7. The covenant continues through Isaac. After Abraham's death, his son Isaac became the heir to God's promises. Isaac married Rebekah, and together they had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. God chose Jacob, the younger son, to carry forward the covenant promises made to Abraham. God even changed Jacob's name to Israel, and from him came the 12 tribes of Israel, marking the beginning of a great nation. God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky began to unfold through Isaac, and later, through Jacob and his children. The covenant made with Abraham was passed down to future generations, continuing to shape the history of Israel. Even though Abraham had passed, God's faithfulness to him and his descendants remained steadfast. Abraham's life and faithfulness were the foundation for what was to come. His descendants would one day inherit the land of Canaan, and through them, all nations would be blessed. The legacy of Abraham's faith continued through Isaac, and the covenant was alive in the generations that followed, fulfilling God's eternal plan for the world. The story of Abraham is a beautiful, emotional journey that teaches us about unwavering faith, trust, and God's incredible love for us. Despite waiting for years and facing the impossible, Abraham trusted God's promises. Even when God's timing didn't make sense, Abraham held on to the hope that God would fulfill what he had promised. His faith wasn't easy, but it was real. The moment when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, his beloved child, the very fulfillment of God's promise, was heart-wrenching. But Abraham obeyed, not because it made sense, but because he trusted God's goodness. And just when he thought he might lose everything, God stepped in, providing a ram to save Isaac. This moment of provision shows us that God is always there, even in our deepest moments of fear and doubt. Abraham's life reminds us that God's love for us is steadfast. He provides when we think there's no way, and he's always guiding us, even when the road is uncertain. The story of Abraham is not just about one man's journey, but about a God who keeps his promises, who loves us enough to guide us through our trials, and who never leaves us, even in the hardest times.